Eleanor Marsh had been invisible for so long that she had almost started to believe it was her natural state. She stood at the edge of the Hadley garden party, a glass of lemonade in her hand that she had not touched, watching strangers move through the afternoon light with the ease of people who had never once been made to feel unwelcome in their own lives. The grass was perfect. The flowers were arranged in the way that only very expensive gardeners could arrange them, and the women were beautiful, or at least dressed in a way that made beauty seem beside the point. Eleanor was 23 years old. She had brown hair that did what it pleased on most mornings, gray eyes that her mother had once called lovely, and a way of standing quietly in a room that most people mistook for shyness. It was not shyness. It was simply a habit she had developed over 14 years of learning that speaking up in her household brought more pain than silence did. Her father, George Marsh, was a decent man in the way that certain decent men are generous with strangers, distracted with family, and deeply fond of peace. When Eleanor was 9 years old, her mother had died of a sudden illness that moved too quickly for doctors to stop. George had grieved in the way he did most things, quietly and briefly. And then 2 years later, he had married Vivienne. Vivienne Carroll, she had kept her first husband's name even into her second marriage, which Eleanor had always found to be an interesting choice, was a tall, fine-boned woman with pale eyes and an excellent sense of what rooms she walked into. She was not cruel in the way that people in stories are cruel. She did not shout. She did not punish Eleanor with dramatic gestures or locked doors or cold meals. She was cruel in a much quieter way. She simply made it known, through 100 small and steady signals, that Eleanor did not quite belong in the world she was trying to create. Vivienne had a daughter of her own. Clarissa was 2 years older than Eleanor, blonde in the way that people notice, and charming in the way that made adults laugh at her jokes and forgive her silences. Eleanor had tried when she was young to be Clarissa's friend. She had offered her books, her quiet company, her willingness to be the less impressive one in any room. Clarissa had accepted all of it with the mild tolerance of someone who does not dislike a stray cat, but has no real use for one. By the time Eleanor was 12, she had understood her position in the house. By the time she was 15, she had stopped fighting it. By the time she was 23, she had built a life for herself inside the edges of that position: books, long walks, letters to a school friend who had moved to Edinburgh, and a genuine love of the countryside that required nothing from her in return. She had not been miserable. That was the thing she sometimes wanted people to understand, if she had been the sort of person who talked about herself, which she was not. She had not been miserable. She had been lonely in a particular way, the loneliness of someone standing in the wrong room, always able to see the right room through the window but never quite certain how to find the door. The Hadley Garden Party was, in the normal course of things, exactly the kind of event that Eleanor attended and did not enjoy, and left without having spoken more than 4 sentences to anyone. Vivienne brought her to these events because George expected it, and because it occasionally happened that a young woman met someone suitable at a county gathering, and Vivienne had a deeply practical understanding of probability. The more occasions, the more chances. She was not trying to be kind. She simply did not want Eleanor becoming the sort of unmarried daughter who took up permanent residence in a household, and who became, over time, a problem. Eleanor was aware of this. She had been aware of it for years. She attended the parties. She wore the dresses Vivienne selected. She smiled when introduced and said the expected things, and ate very little because social anxiety had a way of making her stomach close itself, and she stood at the edges of gardens holding glasses she did not drink from. That afternoon, the garden at Hadley House was particularly full. Lady Hadley was a sociable woman who collected people the way others collected porcelain, and her summer parties were known in the county as occasions where everyone came and no one left before dark. The air smelled of cut grass and roses, and the particular kind of warm afternoon that England produces only a few times a year, as if making up for all the grey ones. Eleanor had found a spot near the far rose beds, away from the main crowd. There was a bench there, iron and slightly uncomfortable, and a view of the garden wall that was genuinely beautiful in the afternoon light. She had been sitting for perhaps 20 minutes, feeling the quiet pleasure of being temporarily left alone, when she became aware of voices on the other side of the hedge. She was not trying to listen. She had no interest in other people's conversations in the ordinary way. But the hedge was thin, and the voices were close, and she heard her name before she could stop herself from hearing it. Eleanor, yes, George Marsh's girl from his first marriage. That was Mrs. Halford's voice. Eleanor recognized it. Mrs. Halford was the sort of woman who arrived at parties early and left knowing everything. "She seems nice enough," another voice, younger, one of the Pemberton daughters possibly. And then Vivienne's voice, clear and light, and carrying the particular ease of someone who has had 2 glasses of wine and no reason to be careful. "Nice enough, yes, that's exactly the word for her. She is nice enough and entirely unremarkable, and I say that with full knowledge of her situation. No figure to speak of, no charm that anyone has ever noticed, no ability to hold a room, a small pause, the sound of a glass being set down. Nobody will ever desire her. I have said it before and I will say it again. She will end up in our house forever, which God help me I am trying to prevent, but some things are simply beyond managing." The garden was completely quiet. The birds were still singing. The distant sound of laughter carried from the main party. None of it seemed to match the strange ringing silence that had settled around Elena. She sat very still. She was familiar with this feeling. It was not new. Over the years she had overheard various versions of this same truth spoken about her, softer versions, more carefully worded versions, once or twice quite direct versions that Vivienne had delivered to her face during moments of particular frustration. She had learned not to crumble. She had learned to take the blow somewhere quiet inside herself and keep her face arranged into something neutral. What was different about this afternoon was that she heard something else a moment later. Not words exactly, a shift in the atmosphere on the other side of the hedge. A sound, the particular sound of someone who has been standing still deciding to move. A deliberate sound, the kind a person makes when they want to be heard. And then the footsteps went the other way, away from her. Around the hedge and across the garden, in a direction she could not see. She sat with her untouched lemonade and the afternoon sun and the ringing that was still in her ears, and she breathed slowly, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was the only way she had ever found to get through these moments. She did not cry. She had not cried over something Vivienne said in 4 years. She had developed, somewhere in her teenage years, the ability to feel something very deeply and show none of it at all, which was either a great talent or a great sadness, and she had never been entirely sure which. After a few minutes she smoothed her skirt. She looked at the rose beds. She noticed that one of the roses near the far end had a particularly unusual color, deep pink at the center, almost white at the edges, and she focused on it the way she focused on books when she needed something to anchor her. She thought about the name for that kind of color gradation. She could not remember it. She thought she had read it somewhere. It was into this small, deliberate, entirely private act of collecting herself that the footsteps arrived. Not the footsteps from behind the hedge, new footsteps, coming from the main garden, crossing the grass with a steady, unhurried pace. Elena did not look up immediately. She had been looked at enough for one afternoon, or rather had been talked about enough, which felt worse. She kept her eyes on the rose. The footsteps stopped about 3 feet away from her. She looked up. The man standing at the edge of the rose bed was tall, which was the first thing she noticed, because it was the most obvious thing. He was perhaps 38 or 40, with dark hair that was starting to silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had probably been handsome in a conventional way when he was younger, and was now something more interesting than that, a face that had experienced things and settled into the result. He was dressed well, but not in the way of someone trying to impress at a garden party. He looked like a man who dressed well out of long habit and had not thought about it this morning. He was looking at the same rose she had been looking at. "That one is called a maiden's blush," he said, not to her particularly, not in the way of someone starting a conversation so much as someone thinking out loud in the presence of another person. "The way the color moves from deep to pale, there is a name for it, I can never remember it." Elena looked at him, she looked at the rose, she looked at him again. "Amber," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "The effect is called amber, though for roses the older books use the word feathered." He turned to look at her then, not with surprise exactly, with interest, the specific interest of someone who had not expected a particularly useful answer and had received one. "That's right," he said. He seemed to be deciding something. And then he sat down on the other end of the bench, not close, not in an intrusive way, with the natural ease of someone who had decided that sitting was the reasonable thing to do, and said, "I'm Charles Ashford. I think I may be related to the family who owns this garden, though I have never been entirely certain how." Elena looked at him. She knew exactly who Charles Ashford was. Most people in the county knew. She had simply not expected him to sit down next to her and say anything at all. "Eleanor Marsh," she said. "I'm quite certain I'm not related to anyone here." He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, a short, genuine laugh, not the polite kind, and said, "That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me at one of these events in several years." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, but she did not look away, which was more than she usually managed with strangers. The afternoon light moved slightly. Somewhere behind the hedge she could still hear the murmur of the party, including, faintly, Vivienne's voice. Charles Ashford looked at the rose beds. Eleanor looked at the rose beds. And for a long, strange, entirely unexpected moment, neither of them said anything at all, and the silence was not the kind she was used to, not the silence of being ignored, not the silence of being somewhere she did not belong. It was a different kind of silence. The kind that exists between two people who are both, for different reasons, happy to have found a quiet corner of a loud afternoon. She did not yet know what had brought him there. She did not know what he had heard. She did not know that the man sitting at the other end of this bench had stood behind a garden hedge 2 minutes ago, and heard a woman say that nobody would ever desire her daughter, and had felt something shift in his chest in a way that made him put down his own glass and walk deliberately across the grass to the bench where she was sitting. She would find out, but not yet. For now there was only the afternoon, and the rose with the amber petals, and the unexpected presence of a man who had, for reasons she did not yet understand, chosen to walk over. Charles Ashford had not planned to come to the garden party at all. He had planned to spend the afternoon going through the estate accounts with his secretary, a quiet, reliable man named Philip who had worked for the Ashford family for 11 years and who always laid the papers out in the same order and kept a pot of tea warm on the sideboard without being asked. It was exactly the kind of afternoon Charles had grown to prefer, organized, purposeful, with no requirement to make conversation with people he barely knew about subjects he had no interest in. But Lady Hadley had sent 3 separate notes in the past month, and Charles had run out of genuine excuses, and his sister Catherine had told him on the telephone that he was becoming the kind of man who would one day be found in a large house alone surrounded by ledgers, and that this was not a dignified way to end up, and he had said, "Thank you, Catherine," in the tone he used when he was ending a conversation, and then he had called for the car and gone to the party. He was 40 years old. He had been a widower for 3 years. His wife Helen had been a good woman, warm, clever, fond of gardens, and better at social events than he had ever been. They had been well matched in the way of two people who complemented each other's edges. Her death had been swift and unfair, and had left him with a grief that had not destroyed him but had changed the shape of him, the way wind changes the shape of a tree over years, slowly, and in ways you only notice when you look back. He had not been looking for anything at the party. He was there simply to satisfy Lady Hadley and prove to Catherine that he was still capable of appearing in public. He had arrived, he had spoken to people he knew, he had held a glass without particularly wanting what was in it, and then he had made his way to the quieter end of the garden, because large gatherings had always been easier to manage from their edges. He had been walking along the hedge path, which ran along the back of the main garden, and was one of those pleasant, slightly ignored routes that old estates always had, when he heard the voices. He had not intended to stop, but his name, not his name, the name Marsh, had caught in his ear, because he had met George Marsh on a county council matter several months ago and had found him to be a straightforward man. He had stopped out of idle recognition, that was all. And then he had heard Vivienne's voice, very clearly, saying the things she said. He stood quite still in the hedge path. The afternoon continued around him. A bee moved past his shoulder. Somewhere behind him a child laughed. He stood still and heard the words come through the thin hedge leaves and settle in the air around him, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, something that was not quite anger but was close to it, and was also something else he did not immediately have a name for. He thought about the bench he had seen on the other side of the rose beds as he walked. He had noticed a young woman sitting there because he had the habit of noticing people who were sitting alone at gatherings, not out of pity, but out of a natural tendency to observe the quieter edges of a room. She had been sitting very still, looking at nothing in particular, with the posture of someone who had made peace with being where she was. He had not connected her to the conversation he had just heard. But he connected her now. He made a decision. He was not entirely sure later why he made it. He was not a man given to impulses. He was methodical and private, and had learned over a long professional life to consider the consequences of actions before taking them. But something about what he had heard, the casual certainty of it, The lightness with which a woman had said those words about another human being made him put his own glass down on the garden wall very quietly and walk around the hedge and across the grass toward the rose beds. He had no clear plan, he was not thinking about what he would say, he was simply moving. She was still there, she was sitting in the same position, but something in the quality of her stillness had changed. It was the stillness of someone who had just absorbed a blow and was deciding where to put it. He recognized that quality. He had seen it in himself, in mirrors, in the months after Helen had died. He looked at the rose beds, and he said the first thing that came into his head, which was the thing about the rose, because he had genuinely been trying to remember the name for that color effect, and because saying something ordinary to a person who has just been hurt is sometimes the most decent thing you can do. She had answered him, quickly and precisely, and without any of the social performance he usually encountered at these events. Just the word and the additional information, and then she had stopped. He had sat down. He was not entirely sure she would speak to him again. She had given him the answer and then retreated back into her stillness, not in an unfriendly way, but in the way of someone who had no particular reason to expect that the conversation would continue. He found this interesting. Most people at social events had a strong investment in keeping conversations going. She seemed entirely comfortable with the possibility that this one might stop. "What are you reading?" he asked. She blinked. "I'm sorry. When you were sitting here before I arrived, I had the impression you were thinking about something specific. I wondered if it was a book." She looked at him with a careful expression that he could not quite read. "I was looking at the rose." Before that, a pause, she was deciding whether to answer honestly or politely. He could see her making the decision, and then she said, "I was thinking about an argument in a book I finished last week. The author makes a claim about the nature of memory that I don't entirely agree with, and I've been working out why." "What's the claim?" She looked at him again. "That we don't actually remember events, we only remember the last time we remembered them." "And you disagree?" "I think it's partially true," she said. "I think some memories stay very close to the original, the ones that catch you off guard, the ones you weren't expecting to think about. Those ones feel different, cleaner." He thought about this. He thought about the particular quality of his memory of Helen in the hospital, which had come back to him on a Tuesday morning 2 years ago while he was standing in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, and which had felt nothing like a copy of a copy. It had felt like the first time all over again. "I think you might be right," he said. She looked at him with an expression of mild surprise, not because he agreed, he sensed, but because he had engaged with the argument at all. They sat together for a while after that. The conversation moved the way conversations move when two people are both comfortable with pauses, not filling the silence out of nervousness, but letting it sit naturally between the things they said. He asked about the book. She told him the author's name and then said that she found the author's earlier work more convincing, which led to a brief disagreement about whether a writer's earlier work is always more honest or whether it simply seems that way in retrospect. She argued one position, he argued the other. Neither of them was trying to win. The afternoon moved around them. The party continued at its polite distance. A few people glanced over at the rose beds and then away again, because a man and a woman sitting on a bench talking was not unusual enough to investigate. Charles, for his part, was noticing things. He was noticing that she did not fill pauses with pleasantries. He was noticing that when she made a point, she made it completely, without decorating it or walking it back immediately the way people often do when they are not sure how their words will be received. He was noticing that she laughed once at something he said, a small observation about the county council that was not especially funny but had the advantage of being true, and that her laugh was unguarded in a way that surprised him. It was the laugh of someone who had forgotten for a moment to manage how she came across. He thought, this is a person who has spent a long time making herself small. He did not say this. He did not know her well enough to say it, and it was not the kind of thing you said to someone you had met 20 minutes ago at a garden party. But he thought it with the certainty of someone who has spent enough time in the world to recognize a particular kind of posture, not of the body, but of the self. The posture of someone who has learned to expect very little from the people around them and has quietly reorganized their life around that expectation. Vivienne's words moved through his mind again. Nobody will ever desire her. He looked at the woman sitting at the other end of the bench, at the way she was engaged with the conversation now, leaning slightly forward, her expression alive with the particular energy of an argument she cared about, and thought that whoever had decided this about her had not been paying any attention. He had been paying attention for less than half an hour, and could already see that she was the most genuine person he had spoken to at a social gathering in a very long time. He thought about saying something, about the hedge, about what he had heard. He decided against it. It was too soon and too strange, and there was no way to say it that would not immediately make this moment about Vivienne instead of about the two of them, and the two of them, he found, was a more interesting subject. So he didn't say it, not today. What he did say, as the light began to shift, and the sounds of the party picked up behind them in the way of a gathering entering its later, louder phase, was, "I'm afraid I've never asked what your position on the Hadley Library is. You seem like someone who would have a position." She looked at him. "The Village Lending Library. I've been twice this month. They recently reorganized the shelves by subject instead of author." "I know," she said, with a feeling in her voice that made it clear exactly what she thought about this. "I take it you disapprove." "I think if you want someone to discover a new author, you put the books by author and let the reader wander. If you organize by subject, you only ever find what you already went looking for." He considered this. It was a small thing, a library shelf organization at a village lending library, but she had said it with the seriousness of someone who believed that small things mattered, that the way you arranged books said something about what you thought reading was for. "I'll tell Lady Hadley you have a complaint," he said. She looked at him. "How does Lady Hadley feel about complaints?" "She finds them charming in my experience. She says it means the person cares." Elena was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I'll write her a letter." "I have been meaning to." And then she seemed to catch herself, as if the naturalness of the statement, the ease with which she had said "I'll write her a letter," as if she had every right to write letters to county ladies about library shelves, had surprised her. She looked down at the glass in her hands, which was still completely full. Charles noticed all of this. He filed it away with the other things he had noticed. The evening gathered itself around them. Somewhere across the garden, Vivienne's voice rose briefly and then settled. A waiter passed with a tray of things. Two women Charles vaguely knew walked past the rose beds, glanced over and continued walking. He should, he supposed, have made his way back to the main party. He had done what he came to do, he had appeared, he had been seen, he had fulfilled his social obligations for at least the next 2 months. He had no reason to stay in this corner of the garden. He stayed. He stayed because the conversation was genuinely interesting, which was not something he could have said about most of the conversations he had participated in recently. He stayed because she had argued with him about writers and about libraries, and had not once asked him about the estate or the dukedom or any of the things people usually asked about first. He stayed because there was something restful about her company in a way he had not expected, not the restfulness of dullness, but the restfulness of someone who was entirely herself, and therefore required nothing performed in return. He stayed until the party lights came on across the main garden and the evening turned golden, and a servant came to tell him that Lady Hadley was asking after him, at which point he stood and said that he had enjoyed the conversation and meant it, and she said that she had too, with the careful honesty of someone who was still deciding how much to trust a pleasant afternoon. He walked back toward the house. He did not look back at the rose beds, not because he had forgotten them, but because he already knew he would be thinking about them for quite some time. Vivienne noticed, of course she did. She had been watching the rose bed corner from across the garden for the better part of an hour, initially because she had thought she heard something odd after she spoke, a rustling in the hedge, a shift in the air, and then because she had looked over and seen, with a feeling she could not quite identify, that Elena was not sitting alone anymore. She had asked Mrs. Halford quietly who the man was. Mrs. Halford had told her. Vivienne had stood very still with her champagne glass and processed this information with the calm, efficient speed of a woman whose primary talent was social arithmetic. Charles Ashford, the Duke of Hadley, widower, 40 years old, one of the most substantial estates in the county, a man who was known to be private and selective about his company and who had apparently walked across a garden to sit next to Elena Marsh and stayed there through the entire turning of the afternoon. Vivienne finished her champagne, She set the glass down, she smoothed the front of her dress. On the drive home, she did not say a word about what she had seen. Elena sat beside Clarissa in the back of the car, looking out the window with her usual quiet expression, and Vivienne sat in the front and watched the countryside move past and thought carefully. She was not a stupid woman, she had never been a stupid woman. What she was and had always been was a practical one, a woman who assessed a situation with clear eyes and then organized herself accordingly. She had married George Marsh for stability and had been correct. She had raised Clarissa to be charming and had been correct. She managed her household and her social position with the same brisk efficiency that she applied to everything else. She had no time for sentiment and very little patience for complication. Elena had, for 14 years, been a simple fact of her life. A quiet, unremarkable fact. A girl who read too many books and walked too many miles and had no particular gifts that Vivienne could see and no social prospects that Vivienne could identify. She had dealt with Elena the way you dealt with furniture that wasn't quite the right style for the room. You worked around it, you didn't invest in it, and you waited for circumstances to change. She had said what she had said at the garden party because she believed it. She believed it fully and without malice, or at least without the particular kind of malice that requires conscious thought. She had been speaking the truth as she understood it to a circle of women who shared her understanding, and she had not been careful, and something had clearly gone differently from how she had expected. The car turned into the drive. She looked at the back of Elena's head. She thought about Charles Ashford sitting on a bench for an hour talking to a girl he had never met before. She thought, I may have been wrong. She did not think about the hedge. She did not think about whether he had been there. That thought, the terrible, specific thought that he might have been standing close enough to hear her, arrived briefly and was dismissed so quickly that it was almost as if it had never arrived at all. It was too uncomfortable to look at directly, so she didn't. She thought instead about what this meant going forward. The change that followed was not dramatic. Vivienne was too clever for drama. It was quiet and systematic, and expressed itself in a dozen small adjustments over the days and weeks that came after the Hadley party. Elena did not notice immediately. She was not expecting to be noticed. The first adjustment was the breakfast table, 3 days after the party. Elena came down to find that her usual chair, the one at the corner, slightly away from the main cluster of the family's preferred seats, had been moved. Her place was now set at the proper center of the table, next to George with a vase of flowers within arm's reach. Vivienne was already seated, pouring tea with great serenity, as if this arrangement had always been the natural one. Elena sat down, she said nothing. She ate her toast and drank her tea and watched the sunlight on the table, and thought about the book she had been in the middle of when she came downstairs. The second adjustment was the matter of her clothes. Not a dramatic overhaul, Vivienne was too precise for that. A suggestion offered at the end of a Thursday morning as Elena was heading out for a walk. I thought we might look at the blue dress for the Pemberton dinner next month. I've always thought you suit blue, said lightly. Said as if this were a casual observation and not the first positive statement Vivienne had made about Elena's appearance in several years. Elena had stood in the hallway with her coat half-buttoned and thought, something has changed. She was right, but she did not yet know why. She went to the Pemberton dinner in the blue dress. It fitted well. It was a better dress than the ones she usually wore to these occasions, and she was aware of this in the way you are aware of wearing something that doesn't apologize for itself. Vivienne had done her hair. That was new. She had stood behind Elena at the dressing table with pins and a composure that suggested she had been doing this regularly for years, which she had not. Elena had sat still and let it happen because she was curious. In the slightly detached way she was sometimes curious about Vivienne's behaviors, the way a scientist is curious about a weather pattern. At the Pemberton dinner, Vivienne introduced her properly. Not the usual murmured, and this is Elena, while already turning towards someone more interesting, but a full, deliberate introduction to the Pemberton family, with Elena's name said clearly, and a brief and accurate description of her reading interests, which made 2 of the dinner guests light up immediately. Elena had ended up in a 40-minute conversation about Victorian natural history that was the most enjoyable dinner discussion she had had in recent memory. She had not, at that point, connected any of this to Charles Ashford. She was slow to connect it, because she genuinely had not expected anything to come of the garden party conversation. She had turned it over in her mind during the days after, with the careful, slightly amazed attention she gave to things that had surprised her, and she had concluded that it had been a pleasant hour with an interesting man who would not give her a second thought. That was how these things worked in her experience. Or rather, it was how things had always worked with her, pleasantly and without consequence. So she received Vivienne's new behavior the way she received most things, with watchful attention and no conclusions. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Charles Ashford had done something the week after the garden party. He had called on Philip, his secretary, and asked him to find out whether the Pemberton family's dinner guest list for the following month included a Miss Eleanor Marsh of Wentham House. Philip had found out, because Philip was very good at finding things out quietly and without drawing attention to the process. He had reported back that yes, Eleanor Marsh was on the Pemberton list. Charles had accepted this information with the composure of a man who had not asked a question. He cared about the answer too. He went to the Pemberton dinner. Eleanor was deep in conversation about Victorian fossils when she looked up and saw him across the room, speaking to their host. The recognition was immediate. She would have recognized him even if she hadn't been thinking about him, which she had been, though she had been careful about the way she thought about him, keeping it in the factual register she used for things she wasn't ready to feel hopeful about. He was tall in a room, she noticed again, not in a way that demanded attention but in the way of someone who occupied space without apology. He saw her. There was a moment, brief, unwitnessed, the length of a breath, in which they simply saw each other, and then the Pemberton son said something to him and the moment passed. They spoke at dinner. She was seated 3 places away from him, which meant direct conversation required effort, but this did not seem to trouble either of them. The conversation about fossils was still going. She pulled it toward him because he was listening, she could tell, even while talking to the person on his left. He joined the conversation when there was a natural opening, adding something about a geological survey he had read, and the conversation expanded and became more interesting, and the 4 people in that corner of the table were still talking when the first course was cleared. She noticed, across the dinner table and the candlelight, that he listened the way some people read, with his full attention on what was being said, without the slight restlessness of someone waiting for their turn. She noticed that he had opinions but was not in love with them. He would hold a position and then adjust it when something she said made him think differently, and he would say, "That's a good point," without making it sound like a concession. This was, she had found, somewhat rare. On the other side of the table, Vivienne watched all of this with the focused attention of someone keeping score. She watched Eleanor talk. She watched Charles Ashford listen. She watched the candlelight and the turning of the dinner, and she thought several things very quickly, including the thought that she had been making a significant error for a long time, which she dismissed, and the thought that there might be a way to be useful in this situation, which she did not dismiss. After dinner, when the company had moved to the drawing room and conversations had broken into smaller clusters, Charles found Eleanor near the bookcase. This was not surprising, because Eleanor was always near the bookcase. "You've changed the subject of conversation," he said. "You changed it back to fossils from plate tectonics, which was where it was getting interesting," she said. "I was wrong," he said easily. "Plate tectonics was the better direction, I apologize." She looked at him. He was looking at the bookcase with apparent interest, which meant she could look at him without it becoming significant. She noticed the lines at the corners of his eyes. She noticed that he was standing at a comfortable distance, not close, not far, not calculated. "You're at a great many of the same events as us lately," she said. She said it without accusation, simply as a fact being placed on the table. He looked at her then. "I might be," he said, and he said it with the directness of a man who was not going to pretend otherwise. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about the garden bench and the lemonade she had never drunk and the afternoon light. She thought about Vivienne's sudden interest in her appearance and her chair position and her social introductions. She thought about all of it very quickly, in the way she thought through things, carefully and all at once. And she said, "I would rather you were direct about it, if there is something to be direct about." He looked at her for a moment, and he said, "I think I am beginning to be direct. I'm going at whatever pace this should go at." She considered this. She found it to be both the most and least satisfying answer she could have been given, which seemed somehow like the right answer. "All right," she said. They talked about the books for a while after that. Vivienne watched from across the room. The village lending library had a particular smell that Eleanor had loved since she was 10 years old. It smelled of paper and old binding glue, and the faint trace of something that might have been lavender. or might have been simply the particular coolness of a stone building that kept itself dim in summer. The librarian, a small, precise woman named Mrs. Dawson who had worked there for 23 years and kept the new acquisitions list in a handwritten ledger, always greeted Elena with the contained warmth of someone who approved of her regulars. Elena came every Tuesday and sometimes on Thursdays. She had her own corner of the reading room, a chair by the window that no one else seemed to want, perhaps because it was drafty in winter. She didn't mind the draft. She brought a cardigan. She was there on a Tuesday in late September when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up from the book she was 4 pages into, a biography of a 19th-century naturalist, chosen because the fossils conversation at the Pemberton dinner had sent her toward geology and then sideways into natural history, and saw Charles Ashford walk in. He saw her immediately. He did not pretend surprise. He simply said, "Good morning," to Mrs. Dawson, received her pleasantly startled response. The Duke of Hadley did not apparently make a habit of the village lending library and walked toward the natural history section, which was 3 shelves to Eleanor's left. "You reorganized," he said, looking at the shelves. They did, by subject. She kept her eyes on her book. "I wrote the letter." "I know, Lady Hadley told me. She called it spirited. She meant it as a compliment." Elena turned a page. "The naturalist section is stronger than I expected. Someone has been donating." He looked along the shelf. "Mrs. Fenwick, I think. Her late husband collected. She didn't know what to do with them." She looked at him. "How do you know Mrs. Fenwick?" "She worked for my family. Her husband did rather in the garden years ago." He pulled a book from the shelf, looked at its spine. "This is a good one. I read it in school." He held it out to her. She took it. She looked at the title and the author, and then at the page that had the date stamp in the front, which showed that nobody had borrowed it in 11 years. "I'll take it after you," she said, and handed it back. He sat down in the chair across the small reading table from her, not the only available chair but the one across from her specifically, and opened the book. She looked at him for a moment. He was reading. She went back to reading. Mrs. Dawson rustled papers behind her desk. A car passed outside. A dog somewhere distant barked twice. They read for 40 minutes. It was, Elena thought, the most comfortable 40 minutes she had spent in company in a very long time. Eventually he closed the book. "I'm going to ask you something," he said without preamble. She looked up. "Would you walk with me after this? There's a path along the south side of the estate boundary that I like. It's about a mile. An hour if we go slowly." He paused. "I enjoy walking. I think better when I'm moving, and I think we have things to talk about." She studied him. "What things?" He was quiet for a moment. He was choosing his words with the deliberateness of a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that words once said could not be recalled. Things that should be said clearly and in the open, and not at dinner tables or garden parties. She closed her own book. She thought about the Hadley garden party and the rose beds and the 40 minutes they had just spent reading in comfortable silence. She thought about the Pemberton dinner and the conversation about fossils and what he had said near the bookcase. "I'm going at whatever pace this should go at." She thought about Vivienne, who was at this moment almost certainly at home, reorganizing something in Eleanor's wardrobe, while planning the next occasion at which Elena might be helpfully placed. She said, "Let me tell Mrs. Dawson I'm leaving the book on the reserve shelf." The path along the south side of the estate was everything he had promised. Quiet, well kept, edged on one side by an old stone wall and on the other by open countryside that moved away in rolling distance toward the hills. It was a good day for walking, cool, with a sky that was doing something interesting with clouds. He walked beside her at the same comfortable distance he had maintained at every occasion, close enough for conversation, far enough for the conversation to be uncomplicated. She had noticed this about him. He was careful with space, not in a stiff way but in the way of someone who understood that distance had meaning and was being intentional about it. He did not open the things he had promised to open immediately. They walked for a while and talked about the countryside and about a property boundary dispute that had apparently been ongoing in the county for 40 years and had become a sort of local legend. She had heard a version of it from Mrs. Dawson. His version was more detailed and significantly more entertaining because he had access to the original paperwork. She laughed at one point, the real laugh, the unguarded one, and he looked at her with something that she chose not to examine too closely. Then he said quietly, "I want to tell you something about the garden party at Hadley." She kept walking, all right. I was on the hedge path, the one behind the rose beds. He was looking straight ahead at the wall and the hills beyond it. I stopped because I heard my name, a name, rather, that I recognized. Your father's name. And then I stayed still because I heard a conversation I had not expected to hear. She said nothing, she kept walking. The path was perfectly smooth here, the ground firm under her feet. I heard what was said, he continued. All of it. I didn't intend to hear it, and I stayed longer than I should have before I moved away. He paused. I wanted you to know that because I disliked the idea of a conversation between us being built on something you weren't aware of. And because I think, if things continue between us, you will find out eventually, and I would rather you found out from me. Eleanor walked. The stone wall moved past on her left. A small bird flew across the path some distance ahead and disappeared into the hedge. She said, "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough to hear all of it. And then you came and sat next to me." "Yes." She thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought through things she needed to be honest with herself about carefully, without rushing to the version that was easier to hear. She thought about whether she was angry. She found that she was not angry in the way she might have expected. She was something more complicated than that. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Yes." "Was it pity?" He stopped walking. She stopped a step later and turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression she could read now. She had been learning his expressions over several weeks of careful attention, and what she saw was not guilt, and was not the particular look of a man who has been caught in something, but was something closer to respect. "No," he said, "it was not pity." "Then what was it?" He looked at the wall for a moment. It was anger first, he looked back at her, and then it was curiosity. "Because you were sitting 15 feet away from where those words had just been spoken, and you were completely composed, and you were looking at a rose and working out what it was called. And I thought, whoever said that about this person has never once properly paid attention to her." Eleanor held his gaze. This was hard. She was not accustomed to being looked at and told something good. "You don't know me well enough to contradict her," she said. It came out carefully, not defensively. "No," he agreed, "that's why I sat down." She turned and started walking again. He fell into step beside her. The path curved gently around a stand of old trees, and the light changed under their branches. "I've been aware of your name my whole life," she said after a while. "The estate, the family. In a county this size, everyone knows the Ashfords, but I've never spoken to you before the garden party. I know I'd seen you from a distance at 1 or 2 events. I hadn't been introduced. But you hadn't crossed any gardens to introduce yourself before." "No," he said. She let that sit. It sat like a weight in the air between them, not an uncomfortable weight, but a real one. "I've been trying," she said slowly, "for several weeks now to work out what is happening. My stepmother is behaving differently toward me. You keep appearing at the same events. I'm not accustomed to being the person in the room that things happen toward. I'm accustomed to being the person that events happen around." He was quiet for a moment. "I think that is probably going to change," he said. "If you want it to." She looked at him sideways. "You are very direct." "I told you I was going to be." "You did." She looked back at the path. "I'm not sure what I want. I want to be honest about that. I'm not in the habit of hoping for things because hoping for things in my situation has not historically been a particularly useful activity." She said this without self-pity as a plain statement of fact. "But I am also not in the habit of being dishonest with myself about what I feel, and what I feel when I am in your company is that I am entirely myself. And I am not entirely myself in most situations, so that is something." He said after a moment, "That is quite a lot, actually." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, but there was something around his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. She said, "I would like to keep walking." "So would I," he said. And they walked, the two of them, along the stone wall and the open countryside and the interesting sky, until the path circled back and the village appeared again at the edge of the fields, and the whole hour had passed without either of them noticing. Clarissa found out on a Thursday. She had been home from her friend's house in Bath for 2 days before she realized something had shifted in the household, and she found out exactly the way she found out most things, by listening at doors, which she had done since she was a child with the practiced ease of someone who had never been embarrassed about it. The door in question was the door to Vivienne's sitting room, where Vivienne was on the telephone with her friend Dorothea, who had been at the Hadley Garden party and had also been at the Pemberton dinner and had the full picture. Clarissa stood in the corridor and listened. She heard the facts delivered in Dorothea's voice. Vivienne had turned the call to speaker, a recent habit she'd developed, and when the call was over she straightened up, smoothed her skirt and went into the kitchen to make tea. She was 25 years old and she was, by any measure, the more conventionally attractive of the two young women in the Marsh household. She had been told this her whole life in various ways, mostly by Vivienne, who believed that knowing your advantages was the first step to using them. She was sociable and lively and drew people to her naturally. She had never in her life wondered whether the people around her found her interesting. She had simply assumed that they did, because they usually demonstrated it. She sat at the kitchen table with her tea and considered the information. Elena and Charles Ashford, walks, dinners, a bench in a rose garden. She considered her feelings about this and found them to be complex in a way she had not expected. She did not dislike Elena. She had never exactly disliked Elena. She had simply never found Elena particularly interesting, and she had never expected Elena to produce circumstances of interest. Elena read books and went on long walks and said quiet, intelligent things at the dinner table that occasionally stopped conversation in a way that Clarissa found slightly tedious. Elena had never, in Clarissa's understanding of the household, been someone who required attention. She went upstairs to change for dinner, and as she passed Elena's room she paused at the open door. Elena was at her desk. She was writing a letter, bent slightly over the paper with the focused posture of someone who wrote as a genuine practice and not as a social form. Her hair was loose, the way she wore it when no one was expected. The evening light came through the window and did something quite particular to the room. Clarissa stood in the doorway for a moment. Elena looked up. "You're back," Elena said. "Last night," Clarissa leaned against the doorframe. "I heard you've been busy." Elena looked at her steadily. "Bath was good, I hope." "It was lovely." Clarissa looked at the room, the books stacked on every flat surface, the shelf of them along the whole of one wall, the small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill that Elena always kept there in summer. "I hear you've been spending time with Charles Ashford." Elena set her pen down. "We've spoken at a few events. And gone on walks. Once, along the estate boundary path." Clarissa was quiet for a moment. She was deciding something. Clarissa made decisions the way she did most things, quickly and with confidence and occasionally without enough information. "He's quite impressive," she said. "The Ashford estate is enormous, and he's not like other men at these things. He doesn't do the usual things." Elena looked at her. She was waiting, with the patience she always had, to find out what Clarissa actually wanted to say. "I was just wondering," Clarissa said carefully, "what you've been talking about, the two of you, what you find to talk about." It was not a kind question. Elena heard the thing behind it, the familiar thing, the thing that said, "What could he possibly find in you that would hold his interest?" She heard it and recognized it and felt it land with a small, familiar sting, and then she picked up her pen. "Books," she said, "mostly, and walking and county things." She looked at the letter she was writing. "I have to finish this before dinner." Clarissa looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "All right," and pushed off from the doorframe and went to her own room. She lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something she could not quite name, not jealousy, exactly, or at least not a version of jealousy she recognized. It was more like disorientation. Like a piece of furniture that had always been in a particular corner had been moved, and the room now looked different in a way she couldn't quite account for. At dinner, Vivienne talked about the next county occasion, a garden lunch at the Fenton house, 2 weeks away. She mentioned, in passing, that it was the sort of event where many of the same people would be present. She did not look at Elena when she said this. Elena passed the bread basket and mentioned that she had also heard from a friend about a lecture series starting in October at the county hall. George asked about the topic. Elena said natural history and geology. George said that sounded interesting. Vivienne said nothing. Clarissa watched Elena across the table. Elena was eating dinner in exactly the same unhurried, attentive way. She always had slightly more bread than necessary, very little interest in the gravy. Eyes moving around the table with that quiet alertness that Clarissa had always found slightly unsettling, because she could never tell exactly what Elena was noting. After dinner, Clarissa found Vivienne in the sitting room. "I want to come to the Fenton lunch," she said. Vivienne looked up from her book. You usually find those things boring. I've changed my mind. Vivienne studied her. She was a perceptive woman and she knew her daughter very well. She saw something in Clarissa's expression that she catalogued and filed away. Of course, she said, it will be nice for you to come, and she returned to her book. What she did not say, because Vivienne did not say things directly when indirectly served the same purpose, was, be careful. What she did not say was, whatever you are thinking, remember that he came to the bench and he came to the dinner and he came to the library and he did not come for you. 2 weeks later at the Fenton Garden lunch, Clarissa wore her best summer dress and arrived at Charles Ashford's elbow at the drinks table within the first 15 minutes. She was charming. She was very good at charming. She asked him questions, and listened to the answers and laughed at the right moments, and was warm and lively and present in the way she had always been present, fully, confidently, filling the space around her with the specific energy of someone who expected to be enjoyed. He was polite, he was genuinely polite in the way of a man who was not unkind and had no quarrel with anyone. He answered her questions, he laughed once, he did not seek to extend the conversation when it came to its natural end. And then, 10 minutes later, he was standing beside Elena near the garden gate, and they were talking about something Clarissa couldn't hear, and Elena was saying something with her hands slightly apart in the way she did when she was making a point she cared about, and Charles was looking at her with his complete and undivided attention. Clarissa watched this from across the garden with her drink in her hand. She watched it until she understood it fully, and then she went to talk to the Fenton daughter, who was standing alone near the roses and looked like she could use the company. She was not a bad person. That was the honest truth of it. She was not a bad person, and she had never exactly meant Elena harm, and somewhere in the 15 minutes standing at the garden gate watching the man she had decided she was interested in give all his attention to the woman she had spent years not quite seeing, she arrived at an uncomfortable truth. She had spent years treating someone like furniture, and the furniture had turned out to be a person, and the person was more interesting than she had ever given herself credit for noticing. She did not apologize that afternoon. She did not know how to apologize without also explaining why she had needed to, and explaining that required more honesty with herself than she was ready for on a garden party afternoon, but she filed it away. She kept it in a part of herself she would need to return to later. On the drive home, Vivienne sat in the front and Clarissa and Elena sat in the back and nobody said very much. Elena looked out the window. Clarissa looked at Elena's profile, the quietness of it, the self-contained stillness, and thought about all the parties she had been to and all the people she had charmed and how she had never once wondered at any of them whether Elena was having a good time. She had not been unkind, she had simply not looked. That night much later when the house was settled and dark, Clarissa knocked on Elena's door. Elena said, "Come in," without looking up from her book. Clarissa stood in the doorway. She did not have a prepared speech. She had never been good at prepared speeches. She was better at saying things in the moment, which had always felt like a gift and felt, right now, like a limitation. "I've been thinking," she said. Elena looked up. "I think I've been unfair to you," she said it quickly before she could rearrange it into something easier. "For a long time, not cruelly, but in the way of not paying attention when I should have." Elena looked at her. Her expression was unreadable in the lamplight. "I'm not asking for anything," Clarissa continued. "I just thought I should say it." Elena was quiet for a long moment, then she said, "All right," and then after a pause, "Thank you." Clarissa nodded. She started to turn away. "Clarissa," she turned back. Elena was looking at her with those steady gray eyes. "I didn't find it easy here, you know that." "I do," Clarissa said. "I should have done more about it." "Yes," Elena said simply, not unkindly, just clearly, "you should have." And she went back to her book. Clarissa pulled the door closed behind her and stood in the dark corridor for a moment and felt the full, uncomfortable weight of a truth she had been avoiding for years. She stood with it for a while, then she went to bed. October came to the countryside with the particular beauty that it always has in England. Quietly, early, turning everything gold before anyone had quite finished with the green. The mornings went cold faster than expected, and the afternoons stayed soft longer than they should, and the light did things to the fields that painters had been trying to capture for 200 years with only partial success. Elena and Charles had fallen into a rhythm without discussing it or naming it, which was, she had begun to understand, the way he preferred things to develop organically at their own pace without the pressure of having words put on them too soon. He was a patient man. She was also a patient person. This was perhaps why they suited each other in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not witnessed it. They met at the library on Tuesdays. They walked on Saturdays, usually along one of the 3 routes he had shown her on different occasions: the estate boundary path, the old mill track, the long way around the church field that came out at the hill with the wide view. They had been to 2 more social occasions, both of which they had arrived at separately and both of which they had spent largely in each other's company without formally acknowledging that this was a plan. What they did during all of this time was talk. Elinor had not understood before this, had not had enough experience to understand what it was like to talk to someone who genuinely wanted to hear what you thought, not because they were being polite, not because they were waiting for a gap in which to speak themselves, but because they were actually curious about the inside of your mind and what it was doing. Charles asked her questions, real questions, not the conversational ones, not "and what do you think of the weather? But you said last week that you disagreed with the book's argument about memory. Have you thought more about it? What did you conclude?" He remembered what she said. He came back to things. He was building, over weeks of conversation, a picture of how she thought, and he seemed to find the construction of this picture to be a genuinely worthwhile project. She was doing the same for him, though she was quieter about it. She had learned that he was methodical in the way of someone who had grown up with large responsibilities, and had learned early that impulsive decisions had consequences that outlasted the moment. She had learned that he was funnier than he appeared, that the dryness she had noticed on the first afternoon was not personality but style, and that underneath it was a genuine and quite particular sense of what was absurd about the world. She had learned that he missed his wife in a way that had settled into his life like weather, present, factored into, no longer acute but real. He had told her about Helen on the second walk. He had done it directly, not as a confession but as an act of fairness. If she was going to know him, she should know this about him. "We were married for 7 years, he had said. She died 3 years ago, a problem with her heart that we didn't know about until it became impossible to not know about." He had said it looking at the fields in the tone of someone who had said the facts enough times that the saying of them was now manageable. She was a very good person, the best person in most rooms she entered, and I mean that plainly, not as a sentiment. She would have found you interesting, I think. She liked people who meant what they said. Elinor had thought about this for a moment. She had said, "Is it difficult, being here in the county where everything is where she would have been?" He had considered this seriously, the way she had learned he considered everything seriously. "Sometimes," he said. "But I think I would find it difficult anywhere, and here at least the difficulty is honest. I know what I'm sitting with." She had nodded. She understood this in a different way, the honesty of a familiar difficulty. The way you could learn to live alongside something hard if you named it clearly rather than moving around it. They had walked in comfortable silence after that, which was one of the things she had come to value most about his company. The silences never needed to be filled. They were simply part of the conversation. On a Saturday in mid-October, he asked her to come to the estate. Not the house, not yet, he was careful about that, she noticed, but the estate grounds. There was something he wanted to show her. She came on a clear, sharp morning when the frost was still on the grass. He met her at the gate, and they walked across the estate fields to a part of the land she had not seen before, a large walled garden that had apparently been his grandmother's project and that had been maintained carefully since. The wall was old stone, covered in the skeletal remains of summer climbers that would come back in spring. Inside, the beds were cut back and raked, but still held the shapes of what they would become. An old espalier apple tree grew along the longest wall, perfectly shaped, every branch deliberate. "My grandmother built this," he said. "She designed everything." She was a botanist in the way that women were allowed to be botanists in her time, which meant she was deeply serious about it and had very little official recognition. Elinor walked slowly along the beds, reading the stone markers that listed what was planted where. She kept records. 40 years of records. I have them in the library. They're extraordinary, detailed observations about every season, what worked, what didn't, why she thought things failed or succeeded. He paused. "I've been wanting to show you this since September." She looked at him. "I thought you would understand it better than most people I might bring here," he said. "That's all." She looked at the apple tree for a moment. She thought about 40 years of records. She thought about a woman who had built a garden in an era that did not take her science seriously, and had kept meticulous records anyway, for herself, because the knowing mattered regardless of the recognition. "I would like to read the records," she said. "I thought you might." They walked the rest of the walled garden in a comfortable, companionable way. He knew what everything was. She asked questions and he answered them without condescension, which she had noticed from the beginning was simply not something he was capable of. He did not talk down to people. It was one of the things about him that she found, in an almost involuntary way, to be admirable. At the far end of the garden there was a bench that had been placed to face the espalier apple tree, an old wooden bench with a particular quality of oldness that suggested it had been there in the grandmother's time. They sat down. The morning was sharp and beautiful. A crow moved across the sky above the wall. "Elinor," he said. Her name and his voice was still a slightly unusual thing to hear. He had started using it a few weeks ago, not as a notable decision but as a natural progression, and she had never commented on it. "Yes, I think I should tell you that I intend to ask your father for permission to court you properly." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the apple tree. His profile was very still. "I should have said it sooner," he continued. I have not moved at the pace I might have, because I have been aware that I am not a straightforward situation, and I did not want to press anything. But I think I'm at the point where not saying it plainly is itself a kind of dishonesty, and I do not want to be dishonest with you." She was very still. The morning air moved. The crow was gone. "I want to know your answer first," he said. "Not your father's, your answer. I'm asking him because it's the right thing to do and because I respect your father. But I am asking you because this concerns you." She looked at the apple tree. She looked at the old stone wall and the frost on the grass and the bare espalier branches that would be covered in blossom in 5 months. She thought about Vivienne's voice through the hedge. "Nobody will ever desire her." She thought about the years of standing at garden party edges with untouched glasses of lemonade. She thought about what it had been like, honestly, plainly, without the version she usually told herself, to move through her life feeling essentially invisible. She thought about the library and the walks and the long conversations about memory and fossils and the nature of honest grief. She thought about a man who had sat down next to her and asked what she was reading and meant the question entirely. "Yes," she said it simply. "I would like you to ask him." He turned and looked at her. And what she saw on his face was not triumph, and was not relief exactly, but was something that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find the right word for. Something that looked like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, setting it down very carefully in a safe place. "Good," he said, and then he did something she had not expected. He reached over and took her hand, briefly, holding it for just a moment in both of his before releasing it. It was such a small gesture, so careful and deliberate, that it took her breath away more than she would ever admit. They sat in the walled garden for another half-hour, talking about the apple tree and the grandmother's records and what the beds would look like in spring. The morning got warmer. The frost melted off the grass. And Elinor, who had spent her whole life learning not to want things she could not have, sat with the very new and very unfamiliar feeling of something she had wanted arriving exactly as it was. George Marsh was in his study when Charles arrived. It was a Monday afternoon, 4 days after the walled garden. Charles had called ahead not by letter, which would have given George too much time to speculate, but by telephone the morning of, asking if he might come by in the afternoon on a matter he preferred to discuss in person. George had said, of course, with the straightforward hospitality of a man who did not read too much into things, and had set aside his paperwork. He was not, when Charles sat down across from him, entirely surprised. He was a man who paid attention in his own quiet way, and he had noticed things over the past weeks, Elinor coming home from walks with color in her cheeks, and a particular quality of aliveness in her expression that he recognized as something she had not worn regularly in recent years. He had noticed Vivienne's new behavior toward Elinor, which he had not commented on but had registered with the careful inner notation of a man who did not often make conflict but did keep account. He had noticed Charles Ashford's name appearing in conversations with an increasing frequency. He listened to Charles speak. Charles did it well, directly, without excessive formality, with the plain honesty of a man who respected the person he was talking to. He stated his intentions clearly. He acknowledged the difference in their ages. He said that Elinor had agreed to the conversation happening, which George found privately to be the most important thing Charles said. George asked one question: does she know her own mind about this? Charles said, I believe she does, and I think she has always known her own mind. She has simply not had many opportunities to exercise it freely. George was quiet for a moment. He looked at his desk. He thought about his daughter, about a 9-year-old girl at a graveside who had held his hand but had not cried until she was alone, because she was already, at 9, the kind of person who protected others from the weight of her own feelings. He thought about the years after. He thought, with the painful honesty of a man who has lived long enough to review his own failures squarely, about the ways he had allowed things in his household that he should have noticed sooner and corrected more firmly. He said, you have my full and genuine permission. He stood and extended his hand. And more than that, you have my gratitude for seeing what was there. Charles shook his hand. They talked for a little longer about county things, about the estate, about nothing in particular, the easy conversation of two men who have come to an understanding and are filling the space around it with decency. When Charles left, George sat in his study for 20 minutes without picking up his pen, and then he went to find Alina. She was in the garden, the marsh garden, modest and familiar, nothing like the walled garden at the Ashford estate, pulling dead blooms off the rose bushes with the focused attention she gave to small, satisfying tasks. She heard him coming and looked up. He stood on the stone path for a moment. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, in the way he had not done enough of in recent years, the way you sometimes stop looking at the people you live with because familiarity becomes a kind of blindness. He came, he said. I know, she said. He told me he was coming today. George nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. You're happy about this? It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. I am, she said. And she said it simply, without qualification, which was the most certain sound he had heard her voice in a very long time. He nodded again. He looked at the roses. Your mother would have liked him, he said. She liked people who didn't perform. Alina looked at him. There was something in her expression that he could not name, something careful and deep and old, something that had been living in her quietly for years. I know, she said. He went back inside. Alina stood with her handful of dead blooms and the October afternoon, and the very real and strange feeling of being looked at by her father and found, not discovered exactly, but found again, like something that had always been in plain sight. She went inside shortly after and found Vivienne in the entrance hall, arranging flowers with the precise attention she gave to domestic tasks. Vivienne looked up when she came in. The expression on Vivienne's face was careful, a controlled version of something more complicated underneath. He came then, Vivienne said. Yes, sir. Vivienne put down the stem she was holding. She looked at Alina with those pale eyes. She said nothing for a moment, and Alina waited. I have not been, Vivienne started. She stopped. She tried again. I said something at the Hadley party. She did not look away. Whatever else Vivienne was, she was not someone who looked away from hard things. Something I said to Dorothea and the others about you. Alina held her gaze. I did not know, Vivienne paused again, with the particular pause of someone who has realized mid-sentence that what they were about to say was not actually an excuse. I spoke without thinking about what I was saying. That is the honest account of it. Alina thought about the bench, about the lemonade she hadn't drunk, about sitting with those words in the afternoon sunlight and deciding, as she had decided so many times before, where to put them. She said, I know what you said, I heard you. Vivienne went very still. I was on the bench on the other side of the hedge, Alina continued. Her voice was steady. I heard all of it. The entrance hall was completely quiet. The flower arrangement sat half-finished in its vase. Outside, a car passed. Vivienne said very quietly, I didn't know. No, Alina said, but he did. He was on the hedge path. That's what brought him to the bench. Vivienne absorbed this. Alina watched her absorb it, the specific, private dismay of a woman who has realized the full picture of what she set in motion. All the weeks of new behavior, the dresses, the introductions, the reorganized seat at the breakfast table seen now in their true light. She had been trying to correct a mistake she didn't know anyone had witnessed. She had been adjusting for a consequence she hadn't connected to its cause. What I said, Vivienne began. I know what you said, Alina said again, gently this time because she was not angry in the sharp way, not anymore. You believed it. That's the part that is hard to put aside, not that you said it. Vivienne looked at her. For a moment something moved across her face that was more honest than Alina had seen from her in 14 years, something that was not managed. I was wrong, she said, just that, no architecture around it, no justification built underneath. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what I thought you were. I am telling you that plainly because I don't know what else to say and I don't think there is anything else that's adequate. Elena looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what forgiveness actually was, not the performance of it, not the pretending that things had been other than they were, but the real thing, the version that required acknowledging the truth and then deciding what to carry forward. She thought about the woman her stepmother was, not a monster, not a villain, but a practical and limited person who had made real decisions that caused real damage, and who was standing in her entrance hall saying so. I appreciate that, Elena said at last. I don't need anything else right now, I just needed to know you understood. Vivienne nodded. She picked up the flower stem again. Her hands were not entirely steady. Elena went upstairs to write a letter. Not to Charles, she would see him in 3 days. She wrote to her friend in Edinburgh, who had been receiving letters about Charles for 6 weeks without ever being told his full name. She told her now. She told her the whole of it, beginning at the bench and the rose with the amber petals and the man who had sat down and asked what she was reading. She filled 4 pages and felt, when she put the pen down, that she had put something outside herself that had been living inside her for a long time, something that had needed to exist beyond the walls of the house where it had grown. She sealed the envelope, she put it on her desk. She looked out the window at the October garden and thought about a walled garden on an estate she would come to know well, and a grandmother's 40 years of records, and the way an apple tree grew when it was tended deliberately over a very long time. Outside her room, the house was quiet in a different way than it usually was, not the quiet of being overlooked, something else, something that was perhaps the beginning of things being different. She had learned not to trust beginnings. She had learned that carefully over years with good reason, but she had also learned in the library and on the walks and in a walled garden on an October morning that the right kind of beginning had a particular quality to it, a solidity, a sense of ground underfoot. This felt like ground. The letter from Edinburgh arrived on a Wednesday, 8 days after Elena had sent her own. Her friend's name was Margaret Elliot. They had been friends since school, the kind of friends who had become close through a shared habit of preferring books to social events, and had maintained the friendship through careful, regular letters that were more honest than most conversations. Margaret was now a lecturer in literature at a university, unmarried by choice, sharp in the way of someone who had spent a career teaching people to look at language carefully. Elena read the letter at breakfast. It was 4 pages long and covered in its 4 pages several topics including but not limited to the nature of unexpected developments, the question of whether a person can truly know someone in a few months, the interesting tension between romantic hope and earned caution, a brief but pointed observation about the social dynamics of what Elena had described, and in the last paragraph a single sentence that Elena reread 3 times. The sentence said, "You have spent your whole adult life making yourself comfortable with not being chosen, and now someone has chosen you, and the question is not whether he is worthy of you, from what you have written, he clearly is, but whether you are ready to let yourself be chosen without waiting for the other shoe to fall." Elena folded the letter, she put it in the pocket of her cardigan, she finished her toast. She thought about the other shoe, she was aware of waiting for it. She had been aware of it since the garden party, the particular habit of a person who has had enough disappointments to expect them, the low background hum of not quite trusting, the way she examined every good thing from several angles looking for the catch. It was not ingratitude. It was not pessimism. It was the survival mechanism of someone who had learned that good things sometimes turned out to have conditions attached. She had not told Charles this. She had not said, "I'm enjoying your company enormously and I believe in the sincerity of what is happening between us, and I'm also braced at some level for it to collapse, because that is what I have learned to be." She had not said it because there was no graceful way to say it, and also because she was not sure it was fair to him to import her history into his consideration when he had given her no evidence of any inclination to disappoint her. She went to the library on Tuesday, and he was there. He was already in the reading room when she arrived, in the chair across the small table, with a book open and a notepad beside him. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing she had noticed in recent weeks, a small, contained settling, as if something in him that had been in a slightly elevated state had found its resting point. She sat down, she pulled off her coat. She looked at his notepad, which was covered in his handwriting, small, slightly cramped, legible if you were used to it, which she was becoming. "What are you working on?" she asked. Estate records, he said. Or rather, cross-referencing two different decades of estate records, which turns out to require a great deal of arithmetic and a strong capacity for frustration. He turned the notepad toward her so she could see the columns of figures. My grandmother kept excellent records of everything except her calculations. She would write the conclusion but not show the working, which from a scientific perspective is deeply unhelpful. But from a human perspective is completely understandable, Eleanor said, looking at the columns. Nobody wants to show all their working. The conclusion is the interesting part. The working is what makes the conclusion reliable. I know, she said, but there's something in the impulse to skip to the answer. The desire to just say, this is what I found, trust me, I got here by careful means. He looked at her. She had the sense that she had said something that touched something he was thinking about, though she hadn't meant it as anything more than an observation about his grandmother's records. Does that apply to other things? He asked, carefully watching her. She met his eyes. It might, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, he put the notepad down, I want to ask you something. She waited. You have been, I have noticed over the past weeks that you are fully present in our conversations, and yet there is something you are holding back, not from the conversations. From the situation. He was choosing his words carefully, in the way he always did when something mattered to him. I want you to know that I am not in any hurry, I am not pressing you. But I also want you to know that if there is something you are waiting to see from me, some evidence of something, I would prefer to know what it is, and address it directly rather than have you watching for it quietly for months. She looked at him for a long time. The library was very still around them. Mrs. Dawson was in the back room. The clock above the door moved its hand to 11:10. She said, I am waiting for the other shoe. He didn't flinch, which she noted. Tell me what the shoe looks like. She considered this. I am not accustomed to being someone people choose, she said. I know that sounds, I understand how it sounds, but it is an honest account of my experience. I have spent 14 years in a household that made it very clear that I was, at best, a fact to be managed. I have attended social events since I was 17 and have been functionally invisible at all of them. And then something happened at one garden party and everything changed, and I believe it, I genuinely believe the change is real. I have enough evidence that it's real. But I am also watching, from somewhere underneath the believing, for the version of events where this turns out to be something other than what it appears to be. She had said it steadily. She had meant to say it steadily, because it was important to say it clearly and not make it into something soft or trembling when it was not a soft or trembling fact. It was simply a fact. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, what would it take, not to stop watching altogether? I think you'll always have some of that instinct, and I don't think it's a bad one, but to trust this enough to stop bracing for the collapse. She thought about it. She thought about what Margaret had said. The question is whether you are ready to let yourself be chosen. Time, she said at last. I don't think there is a specific evidence I'm waiting for. I think I am simply still in the part of believing where I need it to continue to be true for a while before I can hold it fully. He nodded. He picked up the notepad. Then we will let it continue to be true, he said. That is something I can do. And he went back to his estate records as if the conversation had been simple, as if saying I will give you time and I will keep being real until you can hold it was not, in fact, one of the more generous things anyone had said to her in recent memory. She picked up her book. She read 4 pages before she was genuinely in it. And then she was in it, and the library was quiet, and he was working on his records across the table, and time was passing in the good way it passed when you were somewhere you wanted to be. November arrived. The county settled into its winter rhythms. The social calendar thinned, fewer garden parties, more indoor dinners, the particular coziness of a cold county that knows how to draw its curtains. Eleanor and Charles continued to meet at the library and walk when the weather allowed. He took her to see his grandmother's records one afternoon, actual ledgers, kept in the estate library, 43 of them in a row, each one filled from cover to cover in the same small, precise handwriting that had noted every frost date and planting decision and seasonal failure and unexpected success over 4 decades. Eleanor had sat with those ledgers for an hour and a half. Charles had brought tea and had said very little, because he recognized the specific quality of concentration she had, and understood that it required silence the way good music required silence. When she finally looked up, she said, she never published any of this. No, she submitted some observations to a journal twice, I believe. They were returned without comment. Elena looked at the shelf of ledgers, because she was a woman. That was the most likely reason. But she kept going. For 40 years, he said, without institutional recognition or financial incentive or the knowledge that any of it would be read by anyone beyond her family. Elena was quiet for a moment. Why? She meant it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. He considered. I think because it mattered to her to know accurately, he said. The records being accurate was its own point. Whether anyone else saw them was secondary. She looked at the ledgers. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to do a thing well and carefully and honestly for no audience, to take the knowing itself as the justification for the effort. She thought, with a quiet depth she kept to herself, that she understood this perhaps better than most people he might have brought to see these ledgers. On the drive back from the estate that afternoon, passing through the bare-hedged lanes with the low winter light coming from the west, she said, "I'm not waiting for the shoe anymore." He was watching the road. He did not turn. "I realized with the ledgers," she said. "Your grandmother kept 40 years of records for an audience of no one, and here I am, given something real and true, waiting for it not to be." She looked at the hedgerows going past. "I am going to stop waiting for it not to be. I am going to let it be what it is." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you for telling me." "I wanted you to know," she said. "You said you preferred things said directly." "I do," he said. "I very much do." They drove the rest of the way in a silence that had changed quality, warmer somehow, or more settled, the way a room changes when someone opens a window and the right amount of air comes in. The proposal happened in December. Not in the walled garden, that was still too cold, the frost sitting deep in the beds and the espalier apple tree reduced to its bare frame against the old stone. It happened on the long walk, the mill track one, which they had done 4 times now in various weathers and which had become, without either of them formally deciding so, their walk in the way that certain routes become yours when you have walked them enough times with the right person. It was a Saturday, early December. The sky was the pale luminous gray that winter does in England, not heavy but thin, the kind of sky that turns the landscape very clear at its edges. They had been walking for 40 minutes. They had talked about a book she was reading about the history of cartography. They had talked about a piece of county business that had produced a meeting last week that Charles described in such precise and accurate detail that she had laughed properly, the full laugh, unguarded, 3 times. They had passed the old mill pond, which was iced at its edges and perfectly still at its center. They had not run out of things to say and had also been comfortable saying nothing. He stopped at the part of the track where it rose slightly and gave a view across the fields to the church tower and the village beyond it, which sat in the winter landscape like something from a painting. He stopped and looked at it, and she stopped beside him because she knew by now when he stopped to think. And then he turned toward her and said, without any preamble at all, because he was not a man who did preamble, "Elena, will you marry me?" She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full, steady attention she had come to know as the most characteristic thing about him, the quality of being completely present in the moment, of not being anywhere else. She thought, very briefly, about all the versions of herself that had arrived at this particular moment. The 9-year-old at a graveside, the 12-year-old who had understood her position in the household, the 17-year-old who had started attending parties and disappearing into their edges, the 23-year-old who had been sitting on a bench in a rose garden when a tall man had come and sat beside her and asked what she was thinking about. All of those versions, in a line, arriving here. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, not elaborate, not ostentatious, a single oval stone in a simple setting that was old and clearly chosen with specific thought. "This was my mother's," he said. "If you would prefer something else, I'll have something made, but I wanted to ask first in case you liked it." She looked at the ring. She looked at the simple honesty of the gesture, the asking first, the "in case you liked it." She held out her left hand and he put it on and it fitted. "I like it," she said. He looked at her hand for a moment, and then he looked at her, and what she saw on his face was simply happiness, uncomplicated and real, the happiness of a man who had gotten something exactly right. They walked the rest of the mill track. They talked about practical things, when to tell people, what the next steps would be. They talked about it the way they talked about most things, Without drama, with clarity, taking each piece of the future and placing it sensibly in the space in front of them. She said on the way back through the village, "I want to tell my father first." "Of course. And Margaret, my friend in Edinburgh. The one you've been writing to since September." She looked at him. "How did you know?" "You've mentioned her enough times that I know she exists." "I'm glad she does. You should have someone you can tell things to." Elena thought about this. She thought about how unusual it was, how genuinely unusual in her experience, to be with a person who was glad that you had your own people, who did not experience your other relationships as a competing claim on your attention, but as proof of something good about you. She said, "You would like her. She is the most honest person I know aside from you." That sounds like strong praise. It is. They parted at the village road, as they usually did. He was taking the long route back to the estate, and she was walking toward home. He held her hand for a moment before releasing it, the same brief gesture he had made in the walled garden months ago, and she held on for the same moment before letting go. She walked home through the winter afternoon with the ring on her finger and the unfamiliar, almost weightless feeling of something she had wanted being real. George, when she told him, stood up from his desk and hugged her. He was not a man who made large physical gestures, and she felt, for a second, completely young, not in a painful way but in the way that is sometimes possible with a parent, even a complicated one, when they get something exactly right. He said against her hair, "I am so glad." She said, "So am I." Vivienne was told over dinner. George told her calmly and directly, setting down his fork and saying the words plainly while Elena sat across the table and watched. Vivienne absorbed it with the controlled expression she used when she was managing feelings she was not going to show in their entirety. She looked at Elena for a moment, a long, unreadable moment, and then she said, "Congratulations, Elena. I mean that sincerely." Elena looked at her. She thought about the entrance hall and the flower arrangement and the honest words Vivienne had said. She thought about what it had cost a woman like Vivienne, proud, organized, deeply invested in her own self-image, to say that she had been wrong. "Thank you," Elena said. And then she said, because it was honest and it was what she felt, "I hope you will come to the wedding." Something shifted in Vivienne's expression, something careful and a little fragile. "I would like that," she said. Clarissa, told by Vivienne after dinner, came to Elena's room that night without knocking and threw her arms around Elena with an enthusiasm that was entirely unlike her usual composed self, and said, "I am so glad, oh I am so genuinely glad," in the tone of someone who meant it from a very deep place and was not entirely sure what to do with the depth of it. Elena put her arms around her stepsister and held on for a moment and thought about the girl who had never quite been her friend and might, from here on, become something closer to one. The letter to Margaret was 5 pages long. She wrote it in one sitting after the house had gone quiet, with the lamp on her desk and the ring catching the light as her hand moved across the paper. She told Margaret all of it, the proposal, the ring, the walk, the words. She told her about George's hug and Vivienne's congratulations and Clarissa's unguarded joy. She told her that the other shoe had not fallen because there was no other shoe. There was only a man who read in the library and listened without agenda and asked what she was thinking and meant the question. She ended the letter by saying, "You asked me whether I was ready to let myself be chosen. I think the answer is that I am not only ready, I think I was always going to be ready, once the right person came and sat down. I simply needed it to be the right person." She sealed the envelope. She put it with the ring on her desk and looked at both of them for a moment. Then she turned off the lamp and lay in the dark and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely at rest. Not because everything was resolved, not because the past had been erased or Vivienne's words had stopped being true in the moment she had said them, or the years of invisible parties had not happened. They had happened, they were real, she carried them. But she carried them now alongside something else. Alongside a walled garden and a grandmother's records, and a man who had stopped on a hedge path and heard something terrible and chosen, deliberately, to walk across a garden and sit next to her. Who had come back and kept coming back, not because she was convenient or impressive by other people's standards, but because he had paid attention and found something worth returning to. She had been told she was nothing much. She had been told it long and steadily enough that some part of her had begun to believe it in the way that you eventually believe the weather if it stays the same for long enough. But weather changes. and some people look more carefully than others. And some people, a few, in a lifetime, look at you and see not the version that has been diminished by other people's carelessness, but the actual shape of who you are. She fell asleep thinking about the apple tree in the walled garden, which would be covered in blossom by April. The wedding was in April. Elinor had wanted something small, and Elinor had got something small, which in itself was a novelty, wanting a thing, and then receiving it exactly as you had wanted it, without it being adjusted or negotiated into something else by the time it arrived. Charles had agreed immediately. He was not a man who wanted a large event. He had been married once with all the full ceremony that the Ashford name and estate expected, and the ceremony had been beautiful and exhausting, and had very little to do with the actual business of marrying Helen, which had happened somewhere much quieter. The church was the village church, the one with the tower you could see from the mill track on a clear day. It held 40 people comfortably. There were 40 people. George walked Elinor down the aisle. She wore a dress that Clarissa had helped her choose, which was the first time Clarissa had helped her with anything, and the result of which was something genuinely beautiful, ivory wool, long-sleeved, perfectly fitted, with the kind of simplicity that takes real effort to achieve. She had worn her hair as she always wore it when something mattered to her, simply the way it wanted to go. Charles was standing at the altar. He was not a man who performed his feelings at the front of a church. He simply stood and watched her come toward him, and when she reached him, his expression was the one she had learned to trust most, the settled, unperformed, entirely private expression of a man who was exactly where he meant to be. Margaret was there, having come down from Edinburgh on the train the night before, and Elinor had stayed up with her until midnight at the kitchen table at Wentham House drinking tea and talking in the easy, unedited way they talked in letters, the way that lifts when you are finally in the same room as someone whose understanding of you is complete. Margaret had looked at the ring on Elinor's hand and held Elinor's hand with both of hers and said nothing, which was often the best possible thing to say. Vivienne was there. She sat in the second pew beside George, dressed in the quiet, precise style she always dressed in. Elinor had caught her eye as she walked up the aisle, and Vivienne had looked at her directly, not with the careful, managed expression she usually presented in high-feeling moments, but with something plainer and more real. Elinor had nodded. Vivienne had nodded back. It was not the resolution of everything. It was not a clean slate or a revision of history. But it was a moment of honest acknowledgement between two women who had lived in the same house for 14 years, and had not managed to understand each other for most of them, and who were now, at this distance, and with this occasion between them, finding a way to see each other without the old arrangements blocking the view. Clarissa cried. She had not expected to, and was visibly embarrassed about it, but had the grace to let it happen anyway, pressing the back of her hand to her eyes with the composed determination of a woman trying to cry with dignity. Elinor noticed this from the altar, and felt a complicated, warm, genuine affection for her stepsister that she had not felt before, or perhaps had felt in potential for a long time, and was only now finding the room to feel completely. Charles's sister Catherine was there. She had telephoned Elinor twice in the months of the engagement, and each time had said, in the direct manner that was evidently a family characteristic, that she was glad, and that she thought Elinor would be very good for Charles, and that she hoped Elinor knew what she was getting into. Elinor had said that she thought she did. Catherine had said good in the tone of someone who had been worrying about their sibling for 3 years, and could now carefully begin to stop. The vows were the traditional ones because Elinor liked the language of them, and Charles agreed that some things said well for centuries do not need improvement. She said hers steadily. He said his looking at her. There was a moment just before the rings were exchanged, when the late morning April light came through the east window of the church and landed across the altar in a way that was not planned and was not managed and could not have been improved upon, and Elinor stood in it and thought, I will remember this exactly. Not the version of it she would remember later in Margaret's formulation, the actual version. She pressed it into herself on purpose, present tense, aware of being in it while she was in it. The light and the words and the man across from her whose hand was warm around hers, all of it as it was. They left the church to a small crowd of the village people who had come to stand on the path, not because it was required, but because the village felt an investment in the occasion in the Duke of Hadley, who was known and respected and had been quietly grieved over since his first wife died, and in Elinor Marsh, who had been coming to the lending library for years, and who Mrs. Dawson had told several people with considerable satisfaction, was the one who had written to Lady Hadley about the shelves. The reception was at Hadley House. Lady Hadley had offered and Elinor had accepted, with the particular quiet appreciation of someone who remembered clearly what had happened the last time she had been in that garden, and who found it fitting that the story should complete its circle there. The rose beds were not yet in full bloom. It was only April, the county still finding its warmth, but there was green, and there was the beginning of things, and the bench was still there near the far end of the garden. Elinor went there briefly during the reception, when the party had settled into its middle hour, and people were talking and eating, and did not need her for a few minutes. She stood by the bench and looked at the rose beds and thought about the afternoon she had sat here with untouched lemonade and terrible words ringing in her ears, and no expectation at all of what was about to arrive. She felt Charles before she heard him, or rather she heard his footsteps, a sound she had learned the particular quality of over many months of listening for it, and then he was beside her. He looked at the bench, then he looked at her. "First time back," she said. "Is it strange?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "It feels right. It feels like the story wanting to be complete." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him briefly, the way she had learned she could. Around them, through the garden gate and across the lawn, the small party continued its warm and gentle noise. "She was wrong," he said quietly, not as a statement of victory, simply as a fact that deserved to be said clearly in this place once. "Yes," Elinor said, "she was." She let the words sit there in the April air for a moment. She did not want them to be the defining words of the day or of the life that was starting here. They were real and they deserved to be said, but they were not the whole story. They were the beginning of the story, the part that set something in motion, the inciting accident. The rest was her own. In the years that followed, Elinor Ashford, she took the name without hesitation, with the full sense of arriving somewhere she had not known she was traveling toward, built a life that was, by every measure that mattered to her, genuinely her own. She oversaw the establishment of a small lending library on the estate grounds, which she stocked partly from the estate collection and partly from donations, and which was open to anyone in the county 3 days a week. She corresponded with botanists and natural historians and archivists. She edited and organized her grandmother-in-law's records into a form that could be, and eventually was, published, a project that took 4 years, and that the botanical history community received with the particular enthusiasm reserved for long-overlooked work. She attended county events with Charles at his side in the dresses she chose for herself, and the manner that was simply her own manner, unhurried, attentive, not performing. People found her interesting, which no longer surprised her to hear, because she had learned slowly and with some difficulty to let her own assessment of herself take precedence over assessments that had been applied to her without care or attention. She wrote to Margaret every month and went to Edinburgh every summer. She walked the 3 routes she and Charles had made their own, and added others. She read in the library on Tuesdays, often at the same table, often in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had been talking to each other for long enough to know that silence is another form of the same thing. She was happy, not the performed version of happy, not the polite social statement of it, but the real kind, the kind that is not always loud, that does not announce itself at every moment, but that is simply present underneath the ordinary days like water under good soil, reliable and sustaining and there when you look for it. She did not forget where she had come from. She did not pretend that the years in that household had been other than they were. She had been diminished consistently and for a long time, and she had carried it, and it had shaped her in ways both difficult and useful, the patience, the capacity for silence, the habit of looking carefully at things that other people overlooked. She had her stepmother's carelessness to thank in a way she never said out loud for the specific quality of attention she paid to the world. Pain, if it does not break you, teaches you to look more carefully. But she also did not let those years be the ending of the story. She had been told she was not much. She had chosen not to spend the rest of her life proving a negative. She had simply lived generously and honestly and with as much attention as she could bring, and let the living be the answer. Vivienne came to the estate twice a year. They managed a relationship that was not easy and not warm in the deep way, but was real, honest, if limited. They did not pretend to be more than they were. They did not need to. Elinor had made her peace with the fact that some things do not become something new. They simply become something you can hold without being hurt by it. George spent 3 weeks at the estate every summer, in a guest room with a view of the walled garden, and walked with Elinor in the mornings and talked in the evenings, and was, in the later years of his life, more present and more honest and more genuinely her father than he had managed to be when it would have mattered most. She forgave him for this without being asked. because she understood that people sometimes arrive late to the things they should have done earlier, and the arriving is still worth something. Clarissa came at Christmas every other year and brought her husband and eventually her 2 children, who were loud and curious, and ran through the estate grounds with the freedom of children who felt welcomed. Elena was good with them. She had the patience for children that comes from genuinely remembering what it was like to be one. Charles was there through all of it, not as a rescue and not as a solution but as a presence steady and genuine and attentive, the man who had sat down on a bench in a rose garden and asked what she was thinking about and meant the question. He was not perfect. He was sometimes too methodical, too inside his own head, too slow to say things she needed to hear quickly. She was sometimes too self-contained, too slow to ask for what she needed, too practiced at managing on her own in situations where she should have let him in sooner. They had their difficult days and their arguments and the particular frustrations of 2 private people who had each spent a long time alone and had to relearn slowly the art of letting someone all the way in. But they kept choosing each other, consciously, consistently, with the specific intention of 2 people who know that a marriage is not a single decision, but 1,000 small ones made daily, and who decide to make them. There was a day, years into the marriage, when Elena was in the walled garden, her garden now her project, the beds full and deliberate and seasonal, and she found herself standing in front of the espalier apple tree in blossom, as she had imagined it that December night before the proposal, when the idea of it had been a comfort in the dark. She stood and looked at it, all white and heavy with flowers, exactly as she had pictured it. She thought about a sentence she had read once, in a book she could no longer quite remember, about the nature of patience. The sentence had said something about how the long wait changes you, and whether that change is damage or preparation depends entirely on what you do when the waiting is over. She had not known at the time she read it which kind her own long wait had been. She knew now. She reached out and touched one of the blossom clusters, very gently, the way you touch something you know the full history of. Then she went back inside to the library, where her notes were spread across the table and her grandmother-in-law's records waited in their 43 ledgers, and the afternoon was long and the work was good, and everything in the room was exactly where it was supposed to be.